Oh, just for your interest, men and women are a little bit different. These are brain scans. One's of a woman's brain, one's of a man's brain, being asked to think about an emotional situation. Now, I'll just give you a moment to reflect on which one's the woman's brain. A or B? Put up your hand if you think A is the woman's brain. Correct. All right. So here's the man's brain. All right. Being asked to think about an emotional situation. Men and women are actually different. Is that rocket science to you, or is that... our biology and our neurology is a bit different, and women certainly respond to emotion much more than men. Doesn't mean that men don't feel emotions, but I think it's very important, particularly for the women here, that if you're having an emotional conversation with your spouse and you look into his eyes and you say, isn't there anything going on in there? And he says no, you need to realise he's not actually keeping something from you. There isn't actually anything going on in there, right? Yeah. He feels like there should be, but anyway. I will actually just expand on that a little bit. The stress response, the fight or flight response, is predominantly a male response. Women have the fight or flight response, but not nearly so much as men. The testosterone and male hormones accentuate fight or flight significantly, so men can get over activated if we get into problems. Women, when they experience a stressful situation, secrete female hormones, and the female hormones, particularly oxytocin is the most important one, it has an effect of down-regulating the activation response. So women don't tend to get as reactive in that kind of way as men do. So it down-regulates that stress response. And if we gave you a dose of oxytocin up your nose, it'd be acting on your brain within a few minutes. Within a few minutes after that, you would be giving each other shoulder massages and having intimate conversations and nurturing each other. That is, these are the hormones of nurture. And when they actually looked at the research on women, they found that fight or flight is not the predominant response for women. What's now called the tend and befriend response is the predominant response for women. That is, women are much more likely to nurture, to communicate, to look for relationships in dealing with stress than men will often be. A man will often want to get out there and do something about it, will rely much less so on relationships. That both has its strengths and its weaknesses, as does the tend and befriend response. But men and women do actually see and respond to stressors in a slightly different way. We're not actually the same in that regard. Anyway, let's move on from that. Allostatic load is the name that's given to the long-term activation of this stress response. And allostatic load, as you can see, is associated with a whole lot of changes. Impaired immune function, so we get less defense against coughs and colds and infections and more inflammation. So our immune system doesn't respond so well. Accelerated atherosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries, metabolic syndrome, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, etc. That's all a part of what we call metabolic syndrome. Osteoporosis, that's the thinning of the bones associated with the high cortisol that's a part of the stress response. And also the brain ages more quickly, particularly the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. That's the executive functioning in the memory centers of the brain. So this is over the long term, and there's one bit of the brain called the amygdala, and that's the fear and anxiety center of the brain. And the more it's activated, the bigger and more reactive it gets. So it fires off more stress messages with less and less provocation. Now, I'm kind of figuring that most of you weren't so stressed and depressed before you came to this talk, and by now you're really stressed and depressed. So thanks a lot, Dr. Hassett, for giving me all that information. Except that the optimistic side of this coin is that these are all reversible effects by people who learn. Every time you learn something to improve the way that you deal with stress, every time you do something that improves your mental health and your well-being, it has an effect of reversing these effects. So, and it's not just learning mentally to manage our stress better, the healthy lifestyle issues as well help to have a reversing effect on this. And all of the things that are changed in a negative way start to change themselves back in a positive direction. So these are all reversible effects. We're not, if you like, helpless in the view of all of this. So don't just take on this information and say, oh, that's what's going to happen. The important message is to learn how to manage this better. The other thing that we understand about the brain now is that every time we think or do something, we activate the brain in a particular way. The more we activate it in a particular way, the more it's likely to keep on going in the same way. Hebbs was a brain scientist who was around in the middle of last century, and he said that neurons that fire together wire together. Every time we think something, do something, respond in a certain way, the brain configures itself to make that more likely to happen again. Now, just to a quick sort of demonstration of this, if I just ask you to cross your arms for a moment, if you're happy to cross your arms. Now, do you need to think much about crossing your arms or not? You just cross your arms without even thinking about it. Like you didn't make a decision, will I put this arm on top or that arm on top? So now if I ask you to just cross your arms the other way. Some people are still doing this. How does it feel to have your arms crossed the other way? Funny, strange. You want to go back the other way? Oh, that's better. Now, a habit like crossing our arms probably doesn't matter too much. But it's the same thing for all of the patterns of thought, all of our patterns of behaviour, the things the tastes we're used to tasting, that our brain has become conditioned to look for certain tastes, our way of communicating, our way of dealing and responding to challenging events. It's all pretty much wired into our brain. But the change is these days that we used to think once it's wired into the brain, it's wired for all time. We now know that's not true. The brain certainly starts wiring itself pretty fast in childhood, but it's wiring and rewiring itself through the whole of our lives, right into old age. Now, if we want to do something differently, so crossing our arms one way, say, look, I really need to learn to cross my arms the other way. So we start crossing our arms the other way. The first thing we notice is to cross your arms the other way, we notice it takes a lot more attention to do it that way than to do it the usual habitual way. So if we want to change any pattern of thought or behaviour, any habit, it takes attention, because we won't change it without paying attention. If we just do it the same old way without paying attention, it'll just be the same old patterns reinforcing themselves. So it takes attention. And the second thing is it takes a lot more effort to do it the new way than the old way. And our brain and everything else will resist and want to go back to the old way. So it takes effort and sustained effort. But if we do it again and again, and just accept the fact that the challenge and the difficulty is just a part of the territory, then bit by bit the brain will start to wire itself in a new way until it starts to become a bit easier and a bit easier and a bit easier until the new way actually starts to become very easy. In fact, over a long period of time, it actually gets quite hard to go back to the other way. So that is, with what we understand about the brain now, it's just the brain is taking time to wire itself in a different way. But we can literally wire the brain for stress, or we can learn to wire it differently. Some of the first research that was looking at this was looking at London taxi drivers, because we thought your brain can't adapt and doesn't change and new cells don't grow in adult years. But they actually found that, you know, when you've got to learn to be a London taxi driver, you basically pretty much got to get the Millways into your mind. That is, you need the knowledge, as they call it. And they actually found when they did scans of their brain over a 12-month and a 2-year period, they found that there were various areas in the brain associated with memory and spatial sort of navigation skills. They actually found that the grey matter was literally thickening up. So it was like a muscle, if you like, a brain muscle that was being exercised, and it was thickening up. So if you were kept on doing that, learning to write left-handed, the particular area of your brain would actually start to rewire itself to make that easier and easier and easier. We experience it as learning. But we should remember, thinking, if you attempt to think in a different way, do you ever find that your mind resists thinking in a different way and it wants to go back to the same old pattern of thought? Well, it takes attention to, going down the same pattern of thought. It takes effort because we want to go back to the old way even if it doesn't serve us very well. So it actually takes effort and sustained effort until it starts to get easier to adopt a new pattern of thought. So one of the messages I'd like to give as a part of this is not to be hard on ourselves or unreasonable on ourselves, thinking, I want to take up a new pattern of thought or living or whatever, and it's just not easy, I can't do it, I'm hopeless. It's actually a process that takes time. Okay, so we should be gentle enough and kind enough to ourselves to recognise that, and just understand that the process, when it's difficult, is actually a phase that that we're going through. Yeah, well, hypnotherapy takes a slightly different route to mindfulness, but yes, if you practice a particular thought, an affirmation of a different thought, for example, it'll take time and your mind will keep going, no. But if you keep practicing that until pretty soon it's easy to think that way. But we've got to notice that we're going back to the old way in order to, back to the new way.